That damper inside the frame is what makes this system unbelievably simple.
Ooh, 38.
Mountain biking is excellent. Nicolai, who have never exactly had a reputation as dull conformists, might have outdone themselves with their LAL drivetrain endeavour. What catches your eye about this bike isn't so much what is on the frame, but rather what isn't.
The Nicolai Nucleon is a high pivot bike designed around the LAL drivetrain. The bike is essentially a showcase for that drivetrain, as well as a 160-170 millimeter all-mountain sled.
And the fact that it has that LAL drivetrain isn't exactly out of the ordinary. The previous version of this bike had a roll-off internal geared hub and 14-speed internal hub, so they're used to doing things out of the ordinary.
Thanks to that LAL drivetrain, there's essentially no derailleur outboard of the frame, so it's safe from damage. And thanks to the high pivot design of the bike, there's a lot of bump eating performance, as well as a very quiet ride.
So, due to the rules of the internet, if you've ever commented saying you'd buy a decent alternative to the standard drivetrain, you are now legally obliged to do so. And at £39.8 with our control tyres, the Nucleon is by far the heaviest bike on test, so you'd at least be getting a lot of bike for your money. But what's it like to climb?
The Nucleon's seated position is super comfortable and feels quite balanced, thanks in part to the steep seat angle and the very long wheelbase.
The bike has a fairly high level of anti-squat, but there is still a decent amount of suspension movement when you're standing up out of the saddle. Seated is pretty calm, but when you do stand up and kind of put the power down, you do get a decent amount of rear end movement.
The suspension does offer a ton of grip under power, and when you're kind of pointed in a straight line motoring over bumps, the Nucleon handles really well. Additionally, the high pivot is pretty quiet as far as they go. We didn't really notice a ton of draggy noise while pedaling.
And also that unique drivetrain, it doesn't actually offer shifting performance that's that much better than current existing drivetrains on the market.
Though most of the geometry is quite extreme, the angles on this bike are that bit more reasonable. The star of the show here is the high pivot suspension performance with tons of grip and bump eating rearward travel. This bike takes the high pivot decoupling sensation to a whole new height, and without even a mech so much as pulling on your chain, it offers fantastic small bump compliance.
Just because a bike has a high pivot suspension design doesn't mean that they all feel the same. With the Nicolai, it's ultra plush and super smooth tracking on the downhills. This is definitely the true plow bike. If you just want to see rocks and go right through them without turning, this is the bike.
Yeah, all that motoring over bumps and soaking up the terrain kind of has a cost though. This bike is a little more difficult to get off the ground, especially when you're trying to pop between smaller trail features.
As far as the geometry, it's a fairly large reach for a size large. It's like 490 millimeters on the further end of the spectrum compared to other bikes, but it doesn't feel that big, which is kind of nice because you do have a lot of movement happening underneath you, but the actual dimensions of the bike, it's still fairly manageable.
At slower speeds and through kind of pumpy terrain, it can be a little difficult to generate speed. I found it was like really gangly feeling and kind of spread out a bit.
Yeah, definitely not the bike for your flat pedal fest. One additional benefit while descending is how quiet this bike is. One we had has an Onyx hub, which is silent in operation, and then the rest of the bike as well, just basically dead silent, just sucking up all of the obstacles.
Worth noting is that a few of us had heel clearance issues. I myself didn't, but Kaz did, and part of that is because it has a super boost rear end, and in order to package the LAL drivetrain, there's a lot of extra metal back there.
Gone is the derailleur, and instead that lower jockey wheel has been moved to a frame-mounted tension damper that's housed out of sight. So while in some ways it could be said to offer a new avenue of simplicity, it could also be said to offer another layer of complication, especially when you consider that the drivetrain requires a host of proprietary parts. There are several 3D printed cable guides adhered to the frame, and sadly a few of them even came off during testing. The straight cup headset does allow for quite a bit of aftermarket adjustment though, should you want to do so.
Overall, the Nucleon is a good application of a really novel drivetrain. Again, the LAL really benefits people who want something that's going to be out of the way and preventing damage to the derailleur itself.
But we do need to mention that there's a component of the LAL drivetrain that's not immediately visible, It actually has a damper hidden inside the down tube, and that helps deal with the chain slack that occurs when you switch gears. So even though it might look fairly complicated at first, it's even a little more complicated when you really look into what's required for this drivetrain to work.
To only consider this bike as merely an object to hang a novel drivetrain off would be deeply unfair. It has some real strengths. But who would be most suited to this bike? Save for people who are big fans of the Zoidberg-inspired saddles.
The ideal candidate for the Nicolai is someone that's not afraid of trying something new. It does have a drivetrain system that you're unlikely to see elsewhere out on the trail. It's also for someone that prefers steeper, rougher terrain and isn't in a hurry to get to the top.
The downside to that unique and novel drivetrain is the accessibility to aftermarket parts. It's going to be kind of hard to find some stuff for this bike generally, especially when you're fixing parts in the LOL drivetrain. Hopefully they won't get damaged, but if that should occur, it might be a little more tricky to get the parts you need. Additionally, I don't think this is the bike for people who want like a very responsive ride, either up or down the hill. It's more of a plow in both directions.
Exactly. If you got rough terrain and you want ultra smooth, just bump smoothing, it's hard to put into words how good this bike does at just erasing features in the terrain. If that's your purpose and that's what you want to do, this bike definitely fits the bill.
What are its strengths and weaknesses? And is there such a thing as too much grip?
The Nucleon's ability to blast through rough terrain is truly impressive. The high pivot design offers a super smooth bump eating feel that is nearly silent while operating.
As for the cons of the Nicolai, the biggest one's going to be the weight, as well as the fact that it's not the best bike if you want to pump through more moderate or rolling terrain. It's not that responsive, and there could potentially be some more complications when it comes to sourcing replacement parts.
So while we're not necessarily clamoring to ride the Nicolai, we were impressed with some aspects of both its drivetrain and suspension. On a trail that suits it, it is a genuinely exceptional bike. However, its remit is simply too narrow for some. A remit that is further narrowed by its proprietary kit and huge $11,000 price tag.
Kind of bump sucking ability doesn't translate as well when you get on flatter or more rolling terrain.
Sorry. Bump sucking.
Bump sucking.
I want a bike called the Bump Sucker.
Bump sucker, Nicolai Bump Sucker. Come and see it.